There we are. We'll make a start. Well, welcome and thanks for joining us for our webinar concerning home working arrangements. Like all the webinars, I hope you find them useful. I intend for them to be as practical and as relatable as possible so that you have a number of takeaways from each session, essentially. I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Sarah Alford. I'm Head of Employment Law here at Berry Smith. In terms of the kind of things that myself and my team tend to get involved in, we act for a whole host of organisations, right from owner-managed SME businesses, right through to multinational PLCs and public sector and Welsh Government, on a whole host of matters, from your general day-to-day HR queries, and trust me, I've seen them all, through to redundancies, restructures, and also claims in the Employment Appeal Tribunal and the employment tribunals. In terms of what we'll be covering today, well, during this webinar, we'll be discussing the legal and the practical considerations that employers need to consider when they have employees that are working from home, either on a temporary or a more permanent basis. I intend to present for around about 25 minutes, and the remainder of the session will give you the opportunity to ask questions. And if you can please do that via the Q&A box. If you go to the top of your screen, or it may indeed be the bottom of yours, it's got a little Q&A box, a little comment box on the top. If you click on that and do post your questions on that, and I will deal with those as we go through. So just some practical issues. So when the coronavirus pandemic struck and the UK went into lockdown all them months ago in March 2020, many employees like myself packed up their workplace belongings and started working from home. As we now approach the winter months, and who can believe it, it appears that home working is here to stay, well, at least for the time being for many of us, and many office-based workers in any event. Now, there are a number of issues that us as companies and employers are going to need to take into consideration in respect of home working arrangements if you haven't already. Now, I'll go over and we'll discuss some of the practical issues, the outline issues I highlight in this slide, and as we go through the session, then we'll go into those in a little bit more detail to give you some more information. So there are a number of practical issues. As we say, first and foremost, you're going to need to consider tailoring those employment contracts of the relevant employees to encompass home working, or alternatively, issuing new contracts altogether. You're going to need to take appropriate measures to protect, obviously, your confidential information and the personal data of the company. You're going to need to consider reviewing your health and safety implications and ensuring that those necessary risk assessments are carried out. I'm sure you're all well versed in risk assessments. Deciding whether any special equipment should be provided. Reviewing the company's insurance policies if you haven't already done that. Consider how the company is going to manage and supervise those employees that continue to work from home. And finally, you need to think about, if you haven't already, identifying the tax consequences of home working. I'm just going to stop here and pause to say that Berry Smith does not provide taxation advice, and therefore you're going to need to speak to your accountant or indeed your tax advisor to seek independent tax advice when implementing home working arrangements. So as we've seen, there are many advantages of home working, and some of these include obviously reduced overheads. Secondly, increased productivity. Now, employees working from home don't have the commute time to and from the work, and obviously encounter the stresses that involves. So for example, I save around about a 3-hour commute each day to and from the office, and most of that time it has been spent in working. So you may find increased productivity there. Better motivation, so many employers actually respond well to home working, and indeed many of my clients have found that. Skills retention, now that's a biggie for me, so that workers who might otherwise resign due to family responsibilities and commitments, or say for example they've got temporary or permanent disabilities, they actually may remain with the company if they're offered the opportunity to work from home, this work-life balance that we seem to be moving towards. And finally, the disaster management planning. Now, the company may be better equipped to withstand external disruptions, such as transport problems as we move to the winter months, adverse weather conditions. Indeed, as we've seen, established home working can form an important part of the company's disaster management planning. And with every advantage, obviously, there are potentially disadvantages, and those may include loss of control and damage to team working and culture. And different management styles may be required to oversee home workers, and managers may not be able to provide the necessary support, particularly for more junior staff, for example. The company may become overly dependent on technology, and there may be a significant duplication of equipment, for example. And an interesting one, what often crops up is the company may be reliant, well, will be reliant to a large degree on trust of their workers, and may fear that some workers won't, like, pull their weight, if you like. You've got the potential of potential data security breaches, and mental health considerations, in that some employees may experience loneliness and boredom, or may indeed feel alienated or isolated, if you like, from the business as a result of home working. So I'll now go on to discuss some legal considerations that we need to take into account. So first and foremost, let's discuss those employment contracts. So when implementing home working arrangements, or if you move into more permanent home working arrangements, it's really important that each employee's employment contract reflects the true working arrangements. So employment contracts can either be amended, or employees could actually be issued with entirely new contracts. Now, you may remember that April 2020 brought with it a requirement for employers to include additional clauses in the employment contracts for new starters. So if you as a business haven't already revisited your contracts, it may be worth dealing with both the home working and the additional April 2020 clauses now in one fell swoop to avoid duplication. As you're no doubt aware, it's really crucial that employers obtain express written consent of each employee before implementing any contractual changes. That goes without saying. So there are a number of issues that the amended, or indeed the new employment contracts, are going to need to consider and cover off for home working employees. So first and foremost, the most obvious one is obviously the place of work. Now, I'd suggest that the employer's premises is specified as being the principal place of work, so that you can, as employers, maintain control if home working arrangements don't quite work out. So in this instance, the contracts could specify that employees will be allowed to work from home at the company's discretion, especially if you've got ad hoc home working arrangements, and that's what you envisage going forward. Hours of work. Now, it's really important that we establish the boundaries of working time, and in particular when that home worker needs to be available. The employer, or us as employers, are going to need to determine whether each employee will either be completely flexible, for example, observe strict office hours, or whether, as I see in a number of cases, there'll be a core time at which employees must be available. Now, when determining an employee's working hours, it's really important to consider the maximum weekly working hours and the minimum rest breaks that are set out in those working time regulations, 1998. So if you envisage that an employee will be working in excess of 48 hours a week, then you're going to need to ask them to enter into an opt-out agreement. You also need to ensure they take their relevant rest breaks as well. Now, salary and benefits is really important. It goes without saying, obviously, that the salary and benefits provided to those employees that work from home are no less favourable to those that are office-based, if you like. If they're treated less favourably, then a home worker may have a potential claim under the discrimination legislation if they can argue that they're being treated less favourably as a result of a protected characteristic, if you like, or as a result of being a part-time worker. Another important consideration is expenses. As usual, the contract is going to need to specify which expenses the employee can claim. So whilst working from home, such expenses I can think of include, for example, travel expenses to attend the workplace, telephone bills, maybe heating and lighting costs, and any increased insurance premiums. So just set out the expenses that an employee can look to claim. Holidays, well, home workers should have the same amount of holidays as comparable workplace staff, but you should also make it clear that the company's usual arrangements for requesting and approval of holidays will apply. And also it brings us on to illness, actually, and that an employee who works at home should have the same entitlement of sick pay, obviously, but those reporting mechanisms may need to be just adjusted for calling in sick, for example. Confidentiality. So as well as including an express confidentiality clause within those employment contracts, you may also wish to consider precautions for keeping confidential information secure. So for example, you may want to consider forbidding access by household members. You may want to ensure that those computers are password protected or encrypted, for example. And if you have paper documentation, or if they have paper documentation, you may want to consider a secure filing cabinet or providing facilities for confidential disposal, such as a shredder I can think of, or a confidential bin, for example. Now, equipment. So as employees, we're going to need to consider, I imagine you've done this already, but you're going to need to consider what equipment will be used by the home worker and who will provide that equipment, and significantly, who's going to pay for it and who's going to have access to it. Now, what I've found, many of my clients actually, that most employers prefer home workers to use equipment that's provided by the employer. So they can ensure that the employees have got the necessary the equipment, and there's the necessary virus protection and security measures in place. Now, if the home worker is supplied with the company's computer equipment, then you're going to need to consider the application of any systems you have in place for policing the use of equipment. So you're going to need to essentially be satisfied that the risk of any data security breach is low. And this could be done by way of a data privacy impact assessment, which we'll come on to shortly. Now, you can imagine that data protection and confidentiality is a big matter arising as a result of home working. Disciplinaries as well. Now, you may want to consider amending your disciplinary rules and procedures to prohibit home workers from using essentially work time for domestic, family or other commitments, such as household chores, if you like. Alternatively, you may want to consider setting specific rules so that home workers know exactly what's expected of them. And finally there, that I've put on the slide, that the right to enter. Now, the employer, we should reserve the right to enter the employee's home. So, for example, to install, maintain and to service the equipment that you're providing, and also to recover your property on the termination of employment. And finally, to carry out any potential risk assessment that you may need to do for health and safety purposes. Okay, so those are the matters that you're going to need to cover off, the additional considerations within employment contracts. A couple of practical considerations from me. Now, excuse me, I'd strongly recommend that we as employers implement trial periods with regard to home working, so that you've got the ability to bring that home working arrangement to an end if it doesn't work out. So in the event the home working doesn't work out, the employee would then revert from the company's on their previous terms and conditions, essentially as being an office-based worker. It's really important, I can't stress this enough, document and agree that trial period. Okay. Reporting and appraisals. Now, with home working, some employers find that their home workers are concerned that managers or colleagues suspect that they either work less or are less effective, if you like, than workplace-based colleagues, easy for me to say. I think we should all therefore give some thought as to how we're going to measure the quantity and the quality of each home worker's output. Now, I'd suggest that a suitable reporting and appraisal system is agreed at the outset, which should ideally set out exactly what's expected of the home worker. And I'd advise that we obviously put in place regular review systems as well for those reporting and appraisals. Now, in order to avoid any potential discrimination claims, it's really important that the home worker is not denied promotional opportunities that are given to comparable workplace employees. So just don't forget that, okay? I've also got on the slide there childcare. Does the home worker have any childcare responsibilities? If so, how do they fit around the employee's working schedule? I've had the question asked of me, well, we think this individual wants to work from home because they have childcare and they find it difficult to get childcare. And they're scared of asking the question. Well, yes, of course you can ask the question. Do you have childcare in place? Because it's really important that the individual give their time and attention to work whilst they're in work. Now, I appreciate the past couple of months being a little bit difficult. I get that, and some flexibility is being required around that. But in terms of going forward now, well, moving forward, we can ask those questions. Just a point though, it's really important that you remain consistent. So if you ask that of your lady employees, it's also important that you ask that of your male employees as well, to avoid any differential treatment there. Okay. Data protection. So like I said, this is one of the main concerns for an employer with regards to home working. Now, one way of combating this concern is to provide specific training to those employees that work from home, so they're aware of the procedures that they need to follow and specifically how those procedures are going to work from home. You as an employer should also carry out what's known as what we call a data privacy impact assessment. I've got it on the slide here. And the assessment is going to need to cover quite a few things. I'll go through them with you so you can mark them off. But first and foremost, who will have access to the employee's computer and the personal data stored on it? Now, specific security measures should be in place to ensure that members of the household do not have access to the personal data that's held in that computer. Now, the most practical route is obviously going to be for the employer to provide all of the equipment and to forbid, if you like, access to other members of the household. You may also want to consider password protected computers as well. Secondly, will the employee's home be left unattended for regular periods? Obviously, if so, is it properly secured? Does the remote working system permit the employee to encrypt and or password protect information? And is the sharing of passwords obviously clearly forbidden? Are employees instructed to change their passwords at regular intervals? Okay. Where paper files are kept, are there suitable systems for storing, such as secure filing cabinets? And how is information moved between home and office, both in terms of physical transfer of documents, so for example by post or courier, and also by data transfer electronically as well? Are employees given guidance about what data it is appropriate to transfer? And are there rules on retention of documents, proper disposal, for example, shredding of paper-based documents or records? And is equipment provided for the effective shredding of paper records? And what measures will be taken against accidental loss and destruction or damage? Now, there's a lot to cover there, and data protection is a big topic here, and I whistle-stop toured things that I think you need to be covering in that data privacy impact assessment. But what I will do here is signpost you to the Information Commissioner's Office website, the ICO website. There is some I was looking at it actually last week, and there is some very helpful guidance on there for employers in order to comply with your data protection obligations, especially for home working as well. Okay, so do have a look at that. Health and safety. Now, another concern for employers with regards to home working is health and safety. Now, an employer still has a duty of care towards its employees and an obligation to comply with those relevant health and safety requirements, believe it or not, even where the employees are working from the comfort of their own home. Now, I'm not a health and safety expert, okay, but I will briefly address some health and safety issues that you're going to need to consider. Now, the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 states that employers are responsible for an employee's welfare, health and safety, and I'll quote, so far as is reasonably practicable. Now, the company, therefore, are going to need to conduct the risk assessment, you're all well versed in those now, of all the work activities, essentially, that are going to be carried out by home workers to identify the hazards and the degree of risk. Now, in particular, you're going to need to have regard to the following, as I say on the slide there, health and safety issues. So first and foremost, equipment. So any equipment that is provided by you as the employer must be suitable for its purpose. It goes without saying. It must be maintained, it must be in good working order and inspected regularly. You should ask the home worker what equipment do they think they will need, and ensure that they're supported in setting up any new equipment or technology. Now, electricity. So the company is responsible for any equipment it supplies. However, the home worker's domestic supply, including electrical sockets, will be the worker's responsibility. And we as employers should remind them of that, okay? First aid. Now, the company will need to supply appropriate first aid provisions and supplies to its home workers. Now, the type of first aid equipment provided is going to depend to a certain extent on the work that home worker is carrying out. However, assuming that they're working from a computer, a simple first aid kit is likely to suffice. Accidents. Now, the company are going to need to establish a procedure to allow home workers to report accidents and injuries whilst working. And the big consideration there is stress and mental health issues. Now, although some employees may thrive, as we've seen when working at home, from home, some employees actually may find home working quite stressful. So say, for example, some may find it really difficult to separate work from home life, or as I mentioned earlier, actually, they may experience feelings of isolation and loneliness. And therefore the company, we're going to need to consider how it will combat those potential issues, and consider ways in which work and stress levels are going to be monitored. You should also think about how home workers will be able to integrate with their colleagues and teams. And it's important, it goes without saying, that managers should keep in regular contact with those working from home. So, for example, myself and my team, we use Microsoft Teams quite a lot. I know you've got Zoom as well, but Microsoft Teams we find is such a good, it's a free available resource, and it's essentially to a certain extent like they're in the next room to us, because just press a button and assuming they're available, up on the screen chatting away, and there are a lot of free resources out there to combat that, so please do have a look into those. There are a couple of other considerations from me that I'd like to just mention. Special equipment. Now, there is no legal obligation on an employer to provide the equipment necessary for home working, okay? So, but us as employers should look at each individual home worker to ensure that we comply with any duties we may have towards individual employees. So what do I mean by that? Well, essentially, if a home worker has a disability, then the provision of equipment or the reimbursement of employees' equipment expenses may be required as a reasonable adjustment there under Section 20 of the Equality Act 2010. We're also going to need to consider insurance, if you haven't already, okay? You're going to need to review your policies to ensure that any equipment provided by the employer to a home worker is covered. If it is not, and it's not possible, for you to amend your policy, you're going to need to think about asking the home workers to take out and maintain the necessary insurance cover. If this involves an additional cost over and above that of a standard home insurance policy, you may want to agree to reimburse the home worker for any additional costs involved. In addition, employees being asked to work from home, you may also want to ask them to ensure there aren't any issues with them working from home with a home insurer and or mortgage provider or landlord, for example. Okay, that was a whistle-stop tour, if you like, but like I said, we are genuinely here to help in these extraordinary times. So please do get in touch. My contact details are there, either if you'd rather not ask a question or just follow up after this. Myself and my team, we're more than happy to help and support you and come back to you.